Creoso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 240, British Army Reforms. Today we're stepping up into a time of transformation, not just for Wales, but also across Britain, as we're talking about military reform. From 1857 to 1875, the British Army underwent sweeping changes, some born from disaster and some born of fear from falling behind, and others pushed forward by new thinking. How exactly did this era reform the shape and experience of Welsh soldiers and communities and industry? That is the question that we're going to be answering today. And we're going to start actually at the Crimean War. The war, which raged from 1853 to 1856, was fought far from Welsh shores. Yet its impacts, of course, reverberated powerfully throughout all of Britain, and especially Wales. Welsh soldiers fought in the bitter cold of Sevastopol and Balaclava, which we've covered in this podcast, as you can imagine, and often under appalling conditions. But the war didn't just reveal the courage of its soldiers, but it also exposed a glaring weakness in the British military system, a weakness that would eventually drive urgent reforms. In the towns and villages of Wales, the war stirred both pride and horror. Communities from Anglesey to the valleys watched sons and brothers, husbands and fathers leave for service in what many would have thought to be a short, glorious campaign, something we see quite often when it comes to wars and the declarations about how quick they might be. However, this, of course, was not the case as the war continued to drag on. Reports of poor planning, logistical failure, horrendous medical conditions began to circulate. Some of these even directly came from letters of soldiers who were written in various languages, speaking of the difficulty they were feeling, and these letters would eventually appear in newspapers across the UK. Other letters, however, had pointed out how the war had frozen British government politics, with the focus lost talking strictly about the war rather than any domestic policies, and it lamented both the human and financial cost being borne by the country in fighting a war far away and with little relation to the actual people. This, of course, is part of the problem when you're fighting wars in places that are far flung, something that Britain has done pretty much through the entire century and will continue to do until World War I, which is they will be fighting colonial wars stretching from as far away as China and in the South Asian seas, and also as far north as Sevastopol and especially in places like India and Afghanistan, as well as the south of Africa and into the jungles and deserts across the continent. All of these will have a dramatic effect on how people perceive these wars and the focus of them. Of course, most of the colonial wars will be brief and very violent, but they have within them a sign of things to come, and I think it's important to understand that. The conditions, of course, during the war that we're talking about, specifically the Crimean War, were grim. Soldiers often lacked proper winter clothing, food was scarce, and disease spread faster than the bullets. For many working-class Welsh soldiers drawn from the agricultural hardships or the growing and precarious industrial workforce, the squalor of the battlefield felt like an extension of the neglect they were facing at home. As one lender printed in the North Wales Chronicle described, men were freezing like sheep on the mountain while waiting for boots and blankets that never came. Florence Nightingale's groundbreaking work in nursing highlighted the abysmal state of the medical care, but behind her efforts lay thousands of ordinary soldiers who died needlessly from cholera, dysentery, and gangrene. In fact, more soldiers died from disease than from combat wounds during the entire campaign, and this is common in the pre-medical warfare developments. When you look, especially in the Victorian era, a lot of soldiers are being killed by the diseases they're catching because of the wounds that they have, rather than necessarily from the wounds themselves. And all of this is devastating to the military. It's demoralizing, as you can imagine. And on top of that, it's losing troops in a way that you're not expected to lose, at least you would hope. And this goes back even as far as the 1700s and in wars that had happened before that. This is a very common thing that's happening, and it's driving, in some respects, a change in the way the medical community is looking at things and the investigation and scientific discoveries that are coming to help the medical field come out of the fact that they're trying to help this loss of troops to diseases and eliminate as much as possible this suffering. Of course, all of this wasn't lost on the Welsh public. Nonconformist ministers across the country used their pulpits to criticize the government's handling of the war. In areas like Pembrokeshire and Cardiganshire, where literacy rates were higher, thanks to the chapel tradition and communities closely following war reports and editorials, it sparked something of a rare mid-Victorian Britain engagement with the military and its accountability, and it pushed them towards actually being responsible for their actions. Moreover, the failure of the officer corps was especially galling. The fact that many senior officers had purchased their ranks without experience or merit enraged ordinary families who saw their sons led into death by incompetence. There were even demands that the Welsh language pamphlets and newspapers that no soldier should be commanded by someone who had bought his epaulets like a gentleman buying a horse. Keep in mind, this is a long tradition in the British military. Buying your officer position was considered to be the norm. So this had changed in the British Navy, where there was a lot more focus towards merit, and because the Navy was much bigger and much more prominent, it definitely had received much more attention. But the Army had still been sort of the domain of the aristocrats and the upper classes, and now all of a sudden people were like, these are the reasons why we're losing men like crazy, and it needs to change. And you can see how this becomes important. Moreover, the failure of the officer corps created even more demand, and while recruiting in Wales had always had its challenges, economic push factors were often stronger than the patriotic pull. And the aftermath of Crimea caused many to question the value of service. At the same time, calls for reforms were rising and rising. As Wales, of course, was no exception in these calls. Parliamentary debates, including input from Welsh MPs like Henry Richard, known for his pacifist views, echoed public concern about the human cost of an outdated and elitist military. It's worth noting that Wales was beginning to industrialize rapidly during this period, and with that came increasing political awareness and civic organizations. Mutual aid societies, reading rooms, and press gave people the tools to critique the state, and many used those tools to call for better and fairer military systems. So when we speak of the military reform of the 1860s and 70s, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was born in part from the pressure of ordinary people, many of them in Wales, who demanded change after witnessing the cost of failure. The seeds of the Cardwell reforms, which we'll talk about in more depth, were sown in the frozen trenches of Crimea, and they were watered by the voices of families who had paid dearly for Britain's victory. Jumping ahead now to the 1860s, there was another war that captures the attention of the British strategists and public, and it starts to reform a lot of the way that the British thought about warfare and specifically how things were done. This war, of course, is the American Civil War. It would be, along with the Franco-Prussian War, basically the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and the Franco-Prussian War are more or less used by the British to kind of understand and develop strategies and tactics that will then go a long way in what they bring forward into the next century. And it will be a harbinger of things to come. Of course, British never officially joined the conflict. It did closely observe, of course, sent people out to watch the battles. It got involved into some of the smuggling of goods out of the Confederacy. There were some dubious suggestions made during the war, which the British thought about or did, which in some ways were kind of ironic because at the same time you had Canada, which had a very strong Union supporting side to it, kind of being the counterpoint to some of the Southern manufacture and agricultural side, which had intrigued or was one of the reasons why the British were mildly supporting the Confederates. And I say mildly, it's not like they were out there giving them support and comfort. It was more just that they were trying to give them a little bit of help as best as could be done, simply because they needed the cotton that was coming out of the South. This war, of course, was considered to be an industrial one. It was using railways to move troops, telegraphs to coordinate movements, and rifled muskets that rendered old tactics suicidal. The vast scale and attrition warfare was a revelation. In London, these developments spurred debate, but also anxiety. What if Britain had to face a modern warfare again, and what would be the consequence? Something that they maybe should have thought of a little closer when it came to World War I, but nonetheless, that's where they were at that point. This was not an abstract concern. Tensions with France remained high, and potential for colonial uprisings, such as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, made reforms urgent. Welsh observers, many of whom read about the war in the local chapels and public reading rooms, were acutely aware of these changes. Industrial centers like Swansea and Wrexham saw growth in iron and steel output, knowing full well that these materials would be critical in the next conflict. And with that comes the very important Cardwell reforms. So how did the British Army actually change? The answer lies in a set of sweeping reforms enacted by Edward Cardwell, Secretary of State of War, under Prime Minister Gladstone. Beginning in 1868, the Cardwell reforms sought to address the very issues that had plagued the Army during the Crimean War, and were laid bare by the industrial scale of carnage of the American Civil War. So let's look how these changes affected Wales specifically. 1. They ended the purchase of commissions. Before the reforms, commissions in the British Army could be bought, as we mentioned. That meant that wealthy men could purchase officer rank without any training or competence, something painfully evident in Crimea, and Cardwell abolished this practice in 1871, leveling the playing field where merit was more important than upbringing. For ambitious young Welshmen, especially the growing middle class in towns like Aberystwyth or Bangor, this was transformative as it opened a path to leadership based on merit and ability, not privilege and wealth. While system class barriers remained, of course, the door was now at least partially open. Second was the short service enlistment and reserve army. Previously, army service could last up to 21 years. Under Cardwell, the new model was introduced, and it was 6 years of active duty, followed by 6 years of reserve duty. This made service more appealing to young men from working-class Welsh backgrounds, especially from industrial areas like the Rhondda or the Blaenau Festiniog, where they could serve and learn a trade and then return to civilian life, possibly even with a small pension or training under their belt. 3 was the creation of local depots and county regiments. Perhaps the most significant reform to Wales was the localization of the army. Cardwell established regional depots tied to specific counties, encouraging recruitment from local populations and strengthening ties between the regiment and the communities. You have to understand that prior to this, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the South Wales Borderers, as they were called, had been undefined in their geography. So they could have English people as well as Scottish people, as well as Welsh people in the so-called Welsh Fusiliers. This, in and of itself, creates confusion. It's one of the reasons why, when covering the Crimean War, it was very difficult to find information on the Welsh military because there wasn't a Welsh military. They were just basically integrated into the army and then set up to different groups. And so you could have a Welsh soldier who was working in a North English regiment that would be completely outside of their geographical location, and thus you would never know that it was, there was maybe 15 to 20 Welsh people in that regiment. In practice, this meant that the Welsh regiments were now defined by geographic homes, often with training grounds and barracks within or near major Welsh towns. This led to a stronger sense of ownership and identity. Families could now say, "That's our regiment." See sons serve together, supported by community pride. This does have its downsides, which we'll start to talk about when it comes to World War I, but for now, I think it's an important step. The fourth thing was they improved training, supply, and logistics, all of which were a nightmare in Crimea. The efficiency of the Union forces in America, for example, had really stood out to the British, and Cardwell also prioritized better training, supply chains, and standardized equipment to help local regiments to have supplies that they need when they need them. Welsh industry played a critical role here, as the ironworks at Ebervale and the coal mines in the valleys didn't just power Britain, they began supplying material needed for the reform of the army. Uniforms, weapons, and even new rail lines for transport often had Welsh hands behind their creation. As the British Army embraced modernization, it also began, however cautiously, to recognize the importance of regional and national identity. The Cardwell reforms created a county-based regiment that wasn't just an administrative convenience, it also had profound cultural consequences, especially in places like Wales. For centuries, Welsh soldiers had served under the British flag, but rarely under a banner that acknowledged their national heritage. The new regimental system changed that. Regiments like the 23rd Regiment of Foot, now known more commonly as the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, began recruiting directly from the Welsh communities, proudly tying themselves to the Welsh traditions. Suddenly, a soldier from Merioneth or Glamorgan could wear a cap badge with pride, knowing that it represented his community. These regiments became symbols not just of the British Empire, but of the Welsh contribution, character, and sacrifice. For some, of course, there's going to be some backlash on all that, but for now, let's talk about it from that aspect. Military bands began to be included, and in them, they included distinctly Welsh tunes like Men of Harlech, which took on new life as a regimental march and a point of cultural pride. The South Wales borderers, too, began to embrace more of their local identity, which included subtle nods to Welsh symbols such as the leek and the red dragon. These regiments weren't just filled with Welshmen, they were increasingly sounded and felt Welsh. Anecdotes survive of drill instructors barking orders in thick Gwent accents, and of chapel hymns echoing in the barrack halls. This helped build camaraderie and reinforce a sense of common identity that transcended the rigid class divisions typical of Victorian Britain. Of course, with all this is the language. There was a tension around that too. Many Welsh recruits, especially those from rural areas like Carnarvonshire and Cardiganshire, spoke little to no English, and when they were enlisted, they had to learn English. The army was still a deeply Anglicanized institution, made few accommodations for the Welsh language because of that. Orders were given in English, paperwork was in English, promotion exams were in English. As a result, Welsh-speaking soldiers often found themselves marginalized or mocked. There were documented cases of disciplinary actions being taken against soldiers for refusing to speak English, when in reality they simply couldn't. This linguistic alienation mirrored what was happening in the larger British society, where English was increasingly enforced as the language of education, law, and government. And yet, within the ranks, Welsh speakers often found ways to support each other, translating commands, forming unofficial support networks, and maintaining their linguistic heritage quietly but persistently. You could certainly see that, especially if you wanted to talk badly about a particular commander, you could break into a language they may not understand, then that's an advantage in and of itself. And you could totally see that as being one solution, for example. Over time, some officers from Wales began to advocate for more recognition to the unique cultural needs of the Welsh troops. Although progress was slow and limited, still the creation of a Welsh-centric regiment made it at least possible to serve in an environment where one's national identity wasn't erased, even if it wasn't fully embraced either. You'll see this a bit in some of the colonial units and how they're treated and dealt with at times as well. Another key feature of the Welsh soldiers' identity was religion. Of course, Wales remained deeply religious at the time, and throughout the 19th century, with nonconformist chapels traditions shaping much of everyday life. These values of sobriety, hard work, and moral discipline often clashed with the army's more permissive and at sometimes riotous culture. Some Welsh regiments developed a reputation for sobriety and discipline, with ministers back home proudly proclaiming that their boys were God fearing soldiers. In fact, efforts to establish temperate societies within the ranks often had their roots in the Welsh nonconformist traditions, further marking the Welsh regiments as culturally distinct within the British Army. By the 1870s, Welsh soldiers had evolved from nameless cogs in an imperial machine into a more visible and vocal figure within the military establishment. Reforms had made service more equitable, and though cultural and linguistic tensions remained, Welsh identity was no longer invisible in the ranks. There was a powerful shift. The army was still British, still imperial, but it also was becoming more localized, more responsive to its parts. For Welsh communities, this meant that the military service could also not only be a livelihood, but a source of pride anchored in the shared language, local roots, and enduring spirit of the nation that had long fought to retain its distinctive voice. All of this to say is that, keep in mind, we're talking about Imperial Britain, so you're talking about people fighting in far-flung areas still. There's still this movement of regiments to handle problems as far south as South Africa, as far east as China, and as far west as Canada. There's still problems to be had, issues that abound in those colonial territorial grabs and in especially the methods they're using at the time. I mean, the creation of the internment camp is one of a British colonial make that just gets adopted by other people in worse and worse ways. All of these things come about during this period because of the power of the British Army and the way it spreads out. And while, yes, the reforms actually made the army more effective and more efficient and better, it also meant that it made it better in enforcing some of its colonial desires, which we can talk about how good that was for the world. But I think it's important to remember that up until this time, integration was more important than having cultural separation or cultural recognition, even in amongst England, where you have the north of England is quite different culturally than the south of England, and the southwest is different from the southeast. And there was this concept or ideal behind making a formed country that was all glommed together because so many of its parts were resistant. The Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish, for example, as well as the Cornish and even Northern England, were not always fans of being a part of the greater British ideal. And so I think initially the concept was we put them all together, we'll merge them all together, and it'll eventually glom into what we consider to be the English ideal of Britain. And it is an English ideal. In later years, they will come to understand that that's not the route you want to go down. It's not the route you want to necessarily do. But I think it is understandable that having these links back to where these counties are involved in the regiments, I think has a lot of power in creating loyalty to those regiments, something that in the past wouldn't have been the case, as these regiments would have been seen as the arm of the government. Now, all of a sudden, they're the arm of your local brother-in-law or father or son, and all of a sudden there's a slight change in ideal about it. It doesn't change the fact that there are people who don't like it. It doesn't change the fact that people will hate this change, and there will be movements to fight against the British militarism of the time period. But still, you can see the larger population starting to have more empathy and more sympathy for these units because of that. Not only have we changed the military and made it more responsive and better, we've also changed the population from being suspicious of the military and generally resistant to the military to now all of a sudden being a part of the military machine and seeing the value of it, which will go forward right on through the rest of, well, as far as we've reached now, I would argue that's still the case. If you look at the way largely the military is seen, it's not necessarily seen as an appendage for, especially in Western democracies, an appendage for military or government enforcement, but rather as a protector, as a arm in trying to enforce peace quite frequently, even as it's also an arm to carry out war. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess is what I'm saying. But understand that the way the relationship with the military changed at this time is quite dramatic. And it's something to keep in mind as we go forward, is part of our modern understanding of how we look at the military, again, as a Western democracy as opposed to somewhere else, is so different and so unusual compared to what was before that it's hard to explain sometimes how different it was. And with all that, I'd like to thank you for listening today or watching. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast, gmail.com. And you can always, of course, follow me on X, Blue Sky, and Instagram at the Welsh History Pod, at Welsh History Pod, not the. And, or if you want, you can join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you feel like you can support me, you can support me through Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. It's all appreciated. It's all very much reinvested into the podcast. And I thank you all once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.